Have you ever made a financial choice that, when you look back, makes absolutely zero sense? Maybe you bought a stock on a gut feeling, or held on to a losing investment way too long, or, felt the sting of a tiny loss so much more than the joy of a pretty big win? Yeah, you are definitely not alone. For the longest time, we kind of thought of ourselves as these super rational economic beings. But it turns out our brains are hardwired with these, well, let's call them glitches, these biases that often lead us astray, especially when money is on the line. So today, we're going to be detectives. We're cracking the case of our own flawed financial intuition.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. It's 1913 at the famous Monte Carlo casino. The roulette wheel is spinning. The little ball lands on black. Okay, then it lands on black again, and again, and again. And as this streak of blacks kept getting longer, the gamblers around the table got more and more certain, absolutely convinced that red had to be next. I mean, it was due, right? So they started placing huge, massive bets on red. But the ball just kept landing on black, a staggering 26 times in a row. By the time red finally showed up, millions of francs had been completely wiped out.
And that single, totally chaotic night gave a name to a really powerful cognitive bias that we all have, the gambler's fallacy. It's this deeply flawed belief, but a very human one, that past random events somehow influence future ones. Our brain sees a pattern, and it just desperately wants to believe it means something, that the universe is going to step in and balance the scales.
But here's the hard truth. Our intuition is fighting a losing battle against the simple, cold laws of probability. A roulette wheel has no memory. A coin has no memory. Each spin, each and every flip, is its own separate world. 10 heads in a row might feel weird. It might feel like it means something, but it has absolutely zero, and I mean zero, impact on what that 11th flip is going to be. The odds are still stubbornly, unshakably 50-50. And this huge gap between what we feel is true and what is mathematically true, well, that's the first major clue in our investigation.
So if it's not pure logic that's driving these wild decisions, then what in the world is it? Well, our search for answers takes us from the casino floor into the fascinating world of psychology. And our next big clue comes from a revolutionary idea that completely flipped our understanding of risk on its head. It's called prospect theory.
See, for decades, pretty much all economic models were built on this idea of expected utility theory. It basically assumed that we're all rational actors, like little calculators walking around, always making choices to get the most wealth in the end. But then, in 1979, two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they looked at how people actually behaved and said, hold on, that's not what's happening at all. They came up with prospect theory, a model that accepts our irrationality. It says we don't think about our final bank account balance. We think about gains and losses from where we're standing right now.
This theory is so powerful because it gets right to the heart of our psychological relationship with money and with risk. It's not based on pure math, it's based on how things feel. And it all hinges on a few key principles that explain why we make all those irrational choices that we do.
Okay, so first, everything is relative. We don't really care about the difference between having $50,000 and $51,000 in total. What we feel is the joy of gaining $1,000 or the pain of losing it from our current position, our reference point. And second, and this is the big one, we are fundamentally loss averse. The pain of losing something feels way more intense than the pleasure of gaining that exact same thing. This graph right here basically shows you the whole idea in one picture. Just look at how the curve for gains kind of flattens out. The joy you get from an extra $100 isn't as great when you're already up by a lot. But then look at the curve for losses. It is steep. That first $100 loss, man, that hurts a lot more than a $100 gain feels good. It's a simple little S-curve, but it explains so much about why we act the way we do. And hey, Kahneman and Tversky said it perfectly themselves. This simple observation, that the aggravation of losing is stronger than the pleasure of winning, is a core piece of our mental software. It's why you might turn down a fair 50-50 bet to either win $110 or lose $100. Even though the odds are technically in your favor, that potential pain of the $100 loss just looms so much larger than the potential joy of the win.
Now, this loss aversion leads to this really fascinating, kind of weird behavioral switcheroo that they called the reflection effect. So when we're dealing with potential gains, we tend to play it safe, we're risk-averse. We'd rather take a guaranteed win, even if it's smaller, than risk it for a chance at a bigger one. But flip it over to the negative side. If you're faced with a sure loss versus a gamble for an even bigger loss, all of a sudden we become gamblers. We become risk-seeking. We will roll the dice to avoid that guaranteed pain, even if it's statistically a terrible move.
And there's another little glitch in our system, the certainty effect. Our brains just have this incredibly powerful bias towards anything that's 100% certain. We give a sure thing way more weight than it probably deserves. This is exactly why most people would choose a guaranteed $3,000 over an 80% chance of winning $4,000. Even though the second option is mathematically better, that pull of a 100% guaranteed win is just too strong for most of us to resist.
You know, another one of our biases, our tendency to get fixated on really small probabilities, creates this strange paradox. It actually explains why the very same person might buy both a lottery ticket and insurance. Think about it. With the lottery ticket, we're overvaluing that tiny chance of a massive, life-changing gain. With insurance, we're overvaluing the tiny chance of a catastrophic loss. In both cases, we're not acting on pure probability. We're acting on the amplified feeling that's attached to those extreme but super unlikely outcomes.
So it's clear our minds are just riddled with these psychological biases. But the mystery here actually goes deeper. It turns out this isn't just about abstract psychology. A big part of it is about our biology. What's actually going on inside our brains when we decide to take a risk?
It's a really compelling question, isn't it? Are some people just born to be gamblers, born to be risk takers? Well, some fascinating research from Vanderbilt University suggests the answer might just be yes, and it has a lot to do with a famous little chemical you've probably heard of, dopamine.
Right, so dopamine is central to how we experience pleasure and reward. But our brains have this amazing regulatory system. You can think of them like biological brakes called autoreceptors, and they control how much dopamine gets released. Well, the Vanderbilt researchers found something amazing. People who score really high on the personality trait of novelty-seeking, people who love new experiences, they were found to have fewer of these autoreceptors. In other words, they have weaker brakes on their dopamine system.
So if you have weaker brakes, what happens? Any new, exciting, or rewarding experience, whether it's a big gamble or a risky investment, triggers a much bigger dopamine rush. This biological difference can literally create a predisposition for seeking out the thrill of the new and the risky. And it's also a significant risk factor for developing things like drug abuse and other unsafe behaviors. It's all connected.
Okay, let's pull all our evidence together. We've got flawed intuition, like the gambler's fallacy. We have these deep-seated psychological biases that prospect theory explains so well. And we've got individual differences in our brain chemistry. So now, let's take all these clues and investigate a very modern, very high-stakes crime scene where all of these factors collide, the stock market.
Now, on paper, the stock market is nothing like a casino. Casino games are designed mathematically to be negative-sum games, which just means that over time, the house is always going to win. The stock market, though, is historically a positive-sum game. Looking back over the last century, it's provided an average annual return of about 7.9%. As a whole, investors can actually expect to make money over time. But, and this is a huge but, here's the twist. While the market itself might be a positive-sum game, our behavior can turn it into our own personal casino. Research shows that for some people, the market becomes less about patient, long-term investing and more about a place to gamble. And it's driven by the exact same cognitive biases and dopamine rushes we've been talking about. All that frequent impulsive trading can quickly turn a winning game into a personal losing one. And look, this isn't just a theory. A 2022 study of 400 active stock investors in Iran really put this to the test. And this chart shows just how incredibly common these mental shortcuts are. A massive 61% showed a bandwagon effect. Buying something just because everyone else is. Over half showed an endowment effect. That's where you overvalue stocks just because you already own them. These aren't some obscure quirks. These are powerful, widespread forces in the real world of investing. But the study's most shocking finding was this. Using standard screening tools, a full 30%, 1 in 3 of these active investors could be classified as problem gamblers. And the researchers discovered that these problem gambling behaviors were a huge predictor of high-frequency, not-so-great trading. The line between investing and gambling had become dangerously blurred for a lot of people. So, we've identified the culprits behind our flawed financial intuition. It's faulty logic, it's our psychological wiring, it's even our own brain chemistry. These are powerful forces, and they're part of what makes us human. But that brings us to the final and most important question of all. Now that we know about them,
how do we outsmart our own brains?
Well, the good news is we can. Investment experts suggest 4 really concrete steps to fight back against these biases. First, don't rely on gut feelings. Use independent research, facts, figures. Second, create a system for yourself. Define your rules for buying and selling before you get caught up in the heat of the moment. Third, become a scientist of your own behavior. Seriously, keep a journal of why you made a trade and see if emotional patterns start to pop up. And finally, ask for feedback. Find someone you trust to help you see the blind spots that you just can't see yourself.
At the end of the day, the solution to this whole mystery is realizing that our financial mind isn't some perfect machine. It's this complex cocktail of mental shortcuts, deep-seated emotions, and our own individual brain chemistry. But you know what? These forces aren't destiny. Just recognizing them, understanding them, and building systems to counteract them, that's the first and most powerful step you can take towards getting control. So the real question is, now that all the clues are laid out on the table, what are you going to do about them?